right, so we are back with Chris Cutrone. We had a beginning of a stream. There was some static on the line. I don't know what it was. Maybe it was the ghost of Guy Debord trying to interfere. But now I can hear you without any difficulty. And I just want to pick right up from where we left off. So what we're talking about is the Society of the Spectacle, particularly Chapter 4, if we might get to that, which is about the proletariat and representation. And I had mentioned that I believed that Debord's aim of overcoming alienation was misguided, and that the goal would be to learn to and create a society that could take up alienation as a kind of freedom. And you basically, I think, agreed. And you were
I agree.
You were going to explain why Debord ended up in this romantic position, and you were starting to blame Lacan.
Right. So, I mean, I guess, a couple of things. So, as a Lacanian, Debord does take issue with representation per se, representation as such, and, sees a liability in that. We might even say mediation. So, so going back to Rousseau, who's the originator of this concept of alienation. Alienation is dialectical. It's double-sided. And of course, Rousseau is a bourgeois thinker. So the way he thinks about social mediation and alienation in a productive as well as in a destructive sense, it's profoundly influential for Kant and Hegel as philosophers. So their whole notion of metaphysics and a social metaphysics is derived from Rousseau. And I think that there's been a kind of a mistake made by Marxists, that they think that the problem is the social metaphysics per se, rather than the specific social metaphysics that we're dealing with in capitalism.
Right.
And, I would say in its most utopian moments, Marxism, and I've written about this in my Ends of Philosophy piece, does seek to overcome metaphysics per se, or insofar as we've experienced metaphysics historically hitherto. So, right, and so that's the kind of paradox, is that on the one hand, it would be a transformation of metaphysics, as profound as the transformation of bourgeois social metaphysics from that of traditional civilization religion. But probably would go beyond that transformation. In other words, would go beyond philosophy, even bourgeois philosophy, which is something new and different from ancient philosophy. So there, you find moments in Marx and Engels where, especially regarding materialism, it ends up being assimilated to a kind of an empiricism, which it's not, right? It's not some kind of anti-metaphysics. But still, there is a notion of overcoming, abolishing the Aufhebung of metaphysics and the metaphysics of representation. Now, in politics, right, there's the issue of the modern republic, modern democracy, and how it can't be ancient democracy. It can't be participatory democracy. It has to be representative. And therefore, there has to be a non-identity and an alienation between the representative and those that they represent. Right? And so really it comes down, I think, to the party question. In other words, the party as representing the historical mission of the proletariat. That's what Debord doesn't like. And that's what I think has to be defended.
Right. Okay. So let's unpack some of this, because one of the difficulties is that by talking in terms of metaphysics, the social aspect of the difficulty kind of drops away. There's a way of talking about metaphysics that, is
philosophically,
that's common to the realm of philosophy, where, and if you learn philosophy at college, or just through textbooks, there's an assumption of a continuity of the category of philosophy, as if, the Buddhists are talking about something similar to Rousseau.
Oh, God help us.
You know what I mean?
At least from Aristotle to Hegel.
Right.
right? But maybe
Or
also
Plato.
including non-Western.
Yeah, yeah. Nowadays, including non-Western, they try to pack that in. But there's certainly, you
No.
know, there's an attempt to make a You start with Plato, really,
Mm-hmm.
and then you go and through some sort of path to around Kant, maybe, and then you
Mm-hmm.
stop. Is really how,
Oh, right. They stopped
or
before Hegel
and
because
then
Hegel's jumping the shark for them.
right. Then you go from Kant to the analytic tradition to
Yeah, you skip
Wittgenstein.
over Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Marx,
Right.
Hegel.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you skip over all the devils of the 20th century, all the fascist philosophers.
Right. Right. So, but nonetheless, like metaphysics itself, it's described in a variety of ways. You might talk about ontology. You might talk about the substance of the world, but the main reason that metaphysics exists is because the human beings have discovered that there's a difference between the way the world appears
Mm-hmm.
to us
Mm-hmm.
empirically and the way the world is in itself, the way the world actually is. We want to know what it's really made of,
Mm-hmm.
uh,
Mm-hmm.
and I think the reason why uh, the world appears different than it is. There's a couple of reasons. One is because we're perceiving self-conscious beings who have brains and represent the world
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
ourselves, but also because we're cultural and social beings that come up with explanations and ideologies to
So this is
understand.
very Rousseau and Kant. This is very
Right.
bourgeois. No, and it's fine. It's good. I mean, I would say that because Debord is Lacanian, he's also, by virtue of that, Heideggerian. And of course, Heidegger is taking issue with all that. Heidegger thinks that the problem is thousands of years of Western metaphysics that has forgotten being. And Marxism, unfortunately, Marxist materialism, has been, in the 20th century, assimilated to a kind of Heideggerian ontology. And that's deeply unfortunate. But rather than talk about philosophy, let's
Mhm.
let's talk about the political implications of it.
Well,
Right?
that's what I was trying to get to
Yeah.
when I got to the social part.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah, because um, for Hegel, the fact that we have this appearance or this ideological perspective, or we have perceptions which are socially um, produced,
Mm-hmm.
uh, becomes uh, the way in which we can actually experience substance, the way in which we can actually
Yes.
experience the real. That we're
Yes.
we're not actually the very fact of our perception throws us into the substance of the world.
Mm-hmm.
We're not cut off from metaphysics, but we have access to it precisely through uh, the way in which we're divided from it, the way
Uh-huh.
in which we're cut off from it, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a difficult thing to grapple
Contemplate.
with. Yeah, when
It's
you
the
first hear it,
dialectic.
it's yeah. When you first hear it, it sounds like flim flam. I think to a lot of people.
Well, I mean, maybe for some people it sounds like flim flam. For other people, it sounds like deep esoterica. I
Right.
think that it's something much more straightforward, and it's okay to stay with Kant on this one. I think.
Okay.
I know the Hegelians will scream, but I think an artificial distinction between Kant and Hegel has been introduced. That's unfortunate. Meaning a kind of a subject-object dialectic or a theory-practice dialectic, and a metaphysics of understanding that mediation. The subject mediates the object mediates the subject. That we only become subjects by virtue of objectifying the world. And in objectifying the world, we come to recognize our own participation in that,
Mhm.
and that's where our subjectivity comes from. Right?
Right.
So it's not sense data perception, it's not our animal senses, but rather something that really comes from society, namely our practices and our ability to reflect on those practices. And that's why I said it's really Rousseau. It's there when Rousseau distinguishes between human and animal reason or cognition. So animals reason. He says they just have internalized pictures of the world, and given to them by their senses. Whereas we can transform how we imagine the world, right? So we don't just have a kind of replication of sense data perception in our minds, but it's altered, and it's altered by virtue of practices that, real interaction with the world, real relations with the world that come from society, that don't come from our biology.
Well, Chris, I have bad news for us. We're getting now the combo of digital interference and that static. So here's what I'm going to suggest that we do. Now I can't hear myself. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, good. Yeah, you sound good, actually, too. I know you don't like that, but it's better. Okay, so alienation is not just a feeling. In fact, the feeling of alienation might be a good thing because you're beginning to discover some facts about the world when you feel alienated. And I concur. I say the feeling of alienation just because it's a habit of speech or something. It's a habit. It's a way of. It's the way it's usually spoken of.
I think we see alienation, and this gets us back to the party question.
Okay.
That we see alienation not in the immediate moment, but in history.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's not that, like in your empirical reality, just walking around, that you experience alienation. It's rather where history asserts itself and where we feel a kind of historical dislocation, and that is where we can recognize that the world is not as we intended to make it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And that. So the question.
Nor is it recognizable. In other words, it's not what we intended to make, and that's okay. Maybe we make something different from what we intended. That would be freedom too. But rather, it feels like something that we can't take responsibility for.
Right. Yeah, because when you sit down to write a short story, say something I've done, you have a vision of it in your mind, and then inevitably, the when you finish, what you've come up with is usually quite far away from what you originally intended to write. But you can still recognize your own work in it, and even the original vision in it.
That's right.
Hopefully, and maybe
your participation in it, the process of it.
Right. But just the very fact that you're working through time, that your original conception is going to be inchoate, unexpressed, means that once the expression occurs, that it will become objective, alien from you in some ways.
So let's use a topical thing.
Okay.
Shall we?
Mm-hmm.
Abortion.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, we supposedly gained sexual and reproductive freedom in the 60s. But have we?
Well, not in any kind of permanent way.
No. Seriously, even before they overturn Roe, which they might. They probably
Which they
will.
might.
Well, they probably will because the protesters will push them into doing it.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. So? Yeah.
Oh, let's talk about this for just a minute. What you mean by that? Because it did seem to me like the leak of the Alito judgment or the statement
memo.
Yeah,
memo opinion.
His opinion, right? Shouldn't have necessarily been taken to be conclusive as to what the court was going to do.
No.
Right, but it's being taken that way.
The leak was a pressure tactic, either coming from the progressive side or the conservative side.
Maybe in conjunction with each other. Who knows? But it certainly
some benefits. Secret deal among the millennials on the staff.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does benefit the Democratic Party in this moment.
We'll see.
Well, at least it seems to. I think it would. I think it will mobilize the core. It will take people who were feeling disaffected and uninspired and give them a reason to vote. Yeah. So you're saying, though, before the overturning,
before any of that, have we achieved the sexual and reproductive freedom that we were promised by the 60s? No,
Right. Right. And
definitely
that's
not.
and okay, so in what ways what was the vision of that freedom? What was our original intention when we were looking for sexual freedom?
Individual and collective autonomy to make our lives as we wanted to, both individually and collectively. Juliet Mitchell, Women the Longest Revolution, 1966. That we could rearrange our relation to sexuality, to gender roles, to kinship structures, to intergenerational relations, and that would be part and parcel of changing our relationship in the division of labor and in social production and social reproduction, all those things. Have we achieved more individual and collective autonomy?
Well, I think that there is a case to be made that women have achieved more autonomy since the 60s in terms of both their ability to seek divorce and to get out of marriages that are unwanted, and in terms of economic independence. More women are working today, and also they're
That's not
certain
what people wanted in the 60s. They
right.
didn't
So,
want to they didn't want to make family income dependent on two earners. They did not want that.
well, okay, that's the unintended consequence of autonomy under
Well, it's predictable.
capitalism.
People knew that
Yeah.
it would happen. In other words, like Julia Mitchell, who's still alive, she very much says this is not. We have not achieved what we
Right.
intended, and not because it's unintended, but because we didn't overcome capitalism.
Right. Okay. Sure. Okay. So right.
In other
So,
words, in capitalism, it's always going to be not.
but if you are aiming at sexual liberation, liberation around the category of romantic partnership, eroticism, reproduction, um, and gender, say.
It's a
Um,
mistake to think that only happened in the 60s. It's been 200 years since women could choose their husbands.
right.
It's been more than 200 years. That's the bourgeois revolution. That's
Right.
not what we're looking for now.
Yeah.
Right? We're looking for something that is not about, because with women getting the right to vote 100 years ago, with that comes legal juridical autonomy of all kinds, and leaving behind a minority status, being a minor, being a dependent, and so alienation is that the sudden recognition that what we think is freedom is actually unfreedom. Right.
Right.
So, I mean, Yasmin Nair, you've interviewed her.
Mm.
She's big on this. Like gay marriage, what is that? Is that freedom or is it unfreedom?
Right. But
I'm happy to have the right to get married, but I'm also very much aware that it is now compulsory for gay people in the way that it was for straight people. If you
is
want
it
if you want partner benefits, you have to get married. You can't just be a domestic partner. You have to get married.
right? Yeah.
And why is that? Because companies don't want to adjudicate who's married and who's not. They want the state to do that for them.
Right.
Right? And so it means, like, am I married because I love my husband, or am I married because we need two incomes to afford a decent apartment in Chicago? We need
Well,
two incomes to afford a decent apartment in Chicago. And because we are not just roommates, meaning, we are financially dependent on each other, then we need the state to recognize certain things, and we need the option of sharing health insurance. And, it's basically a cost cutting measure. Marriage is a cost cutting measure for individuals and for society.
right. Okay. That's right. But my
Now, I don't want
question.
to get rid of gay marriage, right?
No, I understand.
But come on, like, what is it really? How does it function in capitalism? What is it? In the same way that, like, I don't want to get rid of, like, pornography, but what is pornography? Is that, like, a realm of, like, erotic freedom? No. It's
No,
a it's
it's actually
commodified
yeah.
manipulation. You know,
As my hero Slavoj Žižek points out, it's probably the most conservative genre of filmmaking around. It's the
oh
most
well, no doubt
codified.
about that. Of
Yeah,
filmmaking, but we're not talking about filmmaking. We're talking
right.
about like, have we liberated the gays by getting rid of obscenity laws? Not really. We've channeled it.
Right. Well, I mean, okay. Well, two things. One is to just on the subject of, sexual liberation or the freedom for particular groups in society like homosexuals or whoever. The problem is that the baseline relation under capitalist society is one of unfreedom. So when you might,
But
if you're
why?
looking,
That's the real question. Like the question is, what is the nature of our unfreedom? It's not patriarchy. It's not
no,
gender. It's not Handmaid's Tale. Right? This
no,
shit that we're dealing
right,
with now, that is
right,
not what's going on. Nor is it, I mean, look, the point being, abortion is thousands of years old. It's as old as the human condition. Infanticide was practiced, right? So human cultures have done this for a very long time. Human society and culture has done this for a very long time. Of course, animals do it.
mm-hmm. Right,
Animals, male animals abort the fetuses of competing males in the female animal. I mean, that's just like reality, right? So
mm-hmm.
abortion always exists. It exists forever. It will always exist forever.
Mm-hmm.
So what are we talking about? We're talking about like a legal right, right? And we're also talking about manipulation of a legal right by a political process that demagogically mobilizes morality and cultural values to try to achieve political aims under the guise of law.
Right.
Right? Now, how is any of that to do with freedom?
Well, I'm gonna say how it is to do with freedom. I'm gonna answer that question. The move from let's say a tribal culture in which your abortion is achieved based on the whims, say, of a tribal doctor and the desire of the tribe overall, and the way in which you're situated in the whole community is different and and less free than a woman who wants an abortion
I think
in
that
a legal.
individual human beings still made decisions about that, even in tribal communities. I think
Sure.
that happened. And so, but again, like, let's not just sort of
Well,
naturalize collective over individual versus individual over collective or something like
right.
that.
I'm taking a stab at the difference between the collectivity that
Hmm.
allows for more individual autonomy in a bourgeois society.
Or
And
saddles the individual with more
it's both.
responsibility,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Right. It's right. It's both.
So we live in a society where now, today,
Mm-hmm.
where, you know, basically biological reproduction is an individual responsibility, right? And because it's impossible without suffering catastrophic economic consequences for families to support the children of their children, right? So in other words, like you're kind of on your own. Like you can't bankrupt your parents by having a child of your own, right?
Right.
Which is what you would threaten to do. Like, so we don't have the ability to fall back on as much, um, you know, other kinds of social support.
Right. We are thrown into the labor market as our primary means of support.
Or
Uh,
you have to deal with the state. You have to claim welfare benefits,
right.
because that exists.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's kind of like uh, we have a very hard time taking social responsibility for biological reproduction. So, with personal autonomy, comes personal responsibility.
Absolutely.
How's that working?
It's not working that well today.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I certainly, the socialist position is to decriminalize abortion. Period. And that's
Obviously.
it. Like, in other words, the socialist position is not to make a moral case for abortion.
Right.
Or a cultural case for abortion.
Right.
No. That's on the individual, the community, who knows? Like, people have all sorts of feelings, values, and, support, friends, family.
I mean, overall, socialism aims to decriminalize society, to operate on the level where criminality in the legal system, the police, are no longer necessary, where we will be responsible for ourselves. That's what you mean. It's not that those moral questions will go away. It's just that they won't be settled by
the
state apparatus. Exactly. So this is the kind of the anarchist aspect of the socialist vision of
so why did communist countries criminalize abortion?
I depends on, I would guess, on the times which it was done.
But for a host of reasons: economic, political, social, cultural, meaning they made concessions to popular morality.
Right.
They also made economic calculations. Social policy. It is also in capitalist states. It's a matter of social policy and concession to popular morality. It's a weird mixture of things.
Right.
And so, I think the way I wrote about it was abortion was made legal basically as a function of like the 50s and 60s, coming at the end of that process, where there was less of an imperative to have a high birth rate, and in which morality could allow it, right? So those kind of meeting of those two factors. And ironically, right, it also happened at the time when suddenly you had a surplus population again in the 70s, right? So you had a massive economic downturn and a deindustrialization and a lumpenization of the proletariat. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Freakonomics. Have you heard of Freakonomics?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, so they think that the crime rate goes down when abortion catches up with the population demographics. In other words, that basically the crime spike is from too many people, and then when abortion really kicks in and cuts the population, then crime goes away.
Yeah, and right. And they put it
That's probably true, by the way.
Yeah, they put it in terms of the people who are, the idea is that the people who are aborted are the people
who would have committed crimes,
who are ill-suited for society.
Probably true. If you're an unwanted child, you're probably much more likely to grow up to be a criminal. That is simply true. And why is that? Because of family structures, society.
Right.
No,
I agree. So, so I concur with you that the ultimate solution.
Abortion is a neoliberal thing. We're entering a crisis of neoliberalism. I'm not surprised that abortion is going to go away. It came with neoliberalism. It will go away with neoliberalism. I'm not surprised.
Well, it won't go away.
Well, it never goes away, but it can go away in a different way.
It won't even go away as a legal option for the majority of women in this country.
That was true before Roe too.
Right.
I don't know about the majority, but there were liberal states.
Right. So I think that the majority of states, after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, will find a way to be able to provide their citizens with legal abortion.
Getting back to it, though, alienation.
Right.
When we contemplate these things, rather than like getting fired up, because that's what it's meant to do. It's meant to get us like very upset and politically mobilize us, which just means some fascist mob of one kind or another. A Democrat fascist mob or a Republican fascist mob. Let's resist that, shall we?
Yeah.
Let's take the stone cold Karl Marx, Hegel long view
Yeah.
of history,
Yeah, absolutely.
right? And just say, when we contemplate these things as historical phenomena, that's when we can see alienation.
Right. That's right. And in the alienation, so the alienation that arises from the world that we build being built in such a way that we can't take responsibility for it, and that we can't
We're victims of
change.
our own creation,
Right.
but we don't feel like we're unfolding, however, in a self-contradictory way, the progress and consciousness of freedom, right? Which Hegel still thought could happen through reversals, through producing the opposite of what you think you're doing, socially, politically, historically. That is still freedom. The idea being that capitalism actually makes that even more paradoxical and more alienated.
Well, one of the ways it does that is by taking the human uh, taking the human out of society, taking the to the in other words, because of the way this is happening on the level of the economy, because our social relationships are now mediated through commodities and through the exchanges in the market, and because the world appears to be quantitative and material, and we're kind of subject to the whims of really impersonal forces. We no longer can even see our freedom in the way our actions produce the opposite of what we want. And actually, but nonetheless,
Not
that
even in a
world,
historical long view, right?
right?
And I feel like this is where Debord is a little bit of a naive, because he's stuck in a kind of, well, the Russian Revolution promised freedom but produced unfreedom.
Right.
And, that's Hegelian, and that's okay, because maybe we needed to learn that. And
Right.
so that's what Debord assumes. He assumes, okay, we thought we were going to achieve freedom this way. We learned that it produces a new kind of unfreedom, the spectacle, the cadre, the party. And now we continue the progress in consciousness of freedom by developing beyond the cadre party form. It reminds me of, Moïse Poston, so my old professor. So, he condemned the Russian Revolution, etc. But he also treated it as Stalinism, the result, as somehow necessary.
Mm-hmm.
What if it wasn't? Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I always, like to say, well, it becomes a kind of right Hegelianism. In other words, it ends up under the guise of theory, kind of affirming whatever happened, as somehow, well, historical necessity must have bore out. It must have been because we weren't ready to overcome capitalism in 1917.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I mean, that is the core of the argument, right? And the core of the Debord argument is, well, we overcame that form of capitalism, but now we have this other form of capitalism, the spectacle.
Right. Which
right?
is wrong. Which is, I think, fundamentally wrong. The spectacle.
It's true in some ways. It's a descriptive,
It's just a descriptive in which the culture of a global capitalism appears, but the reality of
it's less of a
local
change than he
economy,
thought.
far less. Yeah.
Than he
Yeah.
thought, and
Yeah.
therefore actually requires less new than he thought too. Like,
Right. But okay. So here's what I want to get at, because this is a very simple question. But do you believe that after a revolutionary change, that Hegelian dialectic, that the alienation that is, I think, necessary for freedom, will continue? That we will have to cope with the fact that our that our aims will not necessarily bear complete fruit. That we may end up creating in the opposite of what we intend.
we're going to create a new freedom problem.
Right.
We just want to get beyond the freedom problem of the value crises of capitalism.
Right.
But we will produce a new freedom problem, and that is not something that we can anticipate. And it's also not something that we can see in Stalinism.
Right. So, like this question of whether or not I mean, from one perspective, Moise Pistone is clearly right that the world was not ready to overcome
No.
capitalism.
He was not right about that because it's been ever less ready since then.
Well, okay,
In other words, maybe it wasn't, but it's only gotten worse.
okay. So
He thought it
now,
got better.
well, what was his thought? What was needed that was absent in 1917?
Post-proletarian politics.
Oh,
Yeah, he thought we needed a post-proletarian politics, but he also thought that in order to have a post-proletarian politics, first you need a proletarian politics.
well, okay. Now this is post-proletarian politics. That could sound like what you're saying is a move away from the attempt to overcome capitalism and
And that's what it's
instead.
been. The new social movements have moved away from overcoming
Right. Okay.
capitalism.
That's what it could sound like it is. I just want to make sure this is what you're saying.
Yeah.
And a move towards instead focusing on the liberation of women on their own. The
Yep.
focus on the liberation of gay people on their own.
Or not just women, let's say gender. Let's say gender relations. That is seen.
Right.
I mean, look, from a certain standpoint, I know that this will like confuse maybe you, but it might confuse the audience more than it will confuse you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not like, look, Marxism might be right or it might be wrong. Really. Mm-hmm. I'm too much of a Marxist to do anything about it. Amor fati. I love my fate. I'm a Marxist. Mm-hmm. But it might be wrong. So let's entertain the other visions. Radical feminism. Let's say that we don't live under capitalism, we live under patriarchy. Okay. And capitalism is really more a function of patriarchy than the opposite, than patriarchy being a function of capitalism. Let's say that that's true. Mm-hmm. Well, we did have, our radical feminist moment. We did. We can't pretend we're still waiting for it over the horizon. We did. Mm-hmm. Has it produced what they promised? No.
Right.
Now, of course, they can say that about Marxism too. They can. The difference being, or queering, right? Like queer liberation. Like, we've made the world perverse. I was watching Richard Seymour and Daniel Tutt on your old Zero Books podcast recently, and they were really agonizing over Lacan. And they were saying, well, Lacan says it's either the father or worse. And we can't say that. Right? Because, to say we're pre-Oedipal now is to say we've regressed. No, we're post-Oedipal. Because if we say we regressed, we're going to end up being conservatives. Mm. Right? And we've moved from a neurotic culture to a perverse culture. And, is that bad? Is that good? Right? Is that regression? Is it progress? Well, we have to say it's progress because otherwise we'll end up being cultural reactionaries. And I'm like, no, why not just admit we've regressed? Pre-Oedipal is not post-Oedipal. We are narcissistic, and it's now not the father, but worse.
I just am shocked. It took me a while to process what you just told me here, Chris. You're telling me that you're watching what they're putting on the old Zero Books channel. This is gulag for as far as I'm concerned. Putting that aside,
no, I mean it's a symptom. It's a symptom, and I just thought this is a real symptom, which is that people don't know what they want.
No, I okay, but what you're raising, I need to address. But I just want to, on a personal note,
yes, I know,
tell you how disappointed.
And those are two haters of me, by the way. So I'm hardly in a position of promoting them. Right, they hate me, right. And I'm just happy to see them circling the drain, like contemplating being Lacanian or not.
Right. So, well, I think the question of Lacan we can come back to. I'm not at all like I have my own critiques of Lacan and Zizek and all of that, but I want to. But to me, it matters what the critiques are.
But the historical view, in other words, since Father Knows Best, since the 50s, right? Because that's what we're hearing now. We're going back to the Middle Ages. Well, wait, maybe we're just going back to the 50s, and that's bad enough. Have we progressed? That's the question. And I would say that from a Marxist perspective, maybe we have not.
That's right. From a Marxist perspective, we have not. And from the perspective of let's say Bentham, there's maybe a case to be made that you know that the total amount of happiness points in the world has increased. There's it's debatable,
It's totally debatable.
Yeah, but you know,
But the issue of radical feminism, to come back to that, in other words, I'm willing to entertain it all. I'm willing to say maybe the way we overcome what's bad about our society is through radical feminism. Or maybe the way we overcome what's bad about our society is Islamic fundamentalism. Maybe.
Look, right, but I mean, here's the thing. The difference between certainly Islamic feminism, Islamic fundamentalism, and radical feminism, perhaps, and Marxism is the focus on and the aim of freedom. I mean, those things are not the freedom is not the aim of radical feminism.
It is, of course, it is. It's freedom from patriarchy.
Yeah,
it's freedom from misogyny.
But right, freedom from, but that's not the same as.
Well, it's freedom to. I mean, it's a positive freedom in the sense of who knows what women might create unchained from patriarchy and misogyny.
Right, but I think that radical feminism could very often enough becomes, or forget.
No, by the way, Margaret Atwood, right, The Handmaid's Tale, her vision of Gilead is that actually the feminists joined the Nazis.
Right.
That is her vision, right?
Yeah,
her vision is some perverse, like, weird meeting of opposites, you know? And she had a conservative critique of feminism. She's a red Tory.
Right. There's a way in which other liberatory projects are not really liberatory, but are aiming at a return. And, you know, in feminism, it's a return to the natural order of the mother or something like that.
Maybe. I mean, that's womanism. That's not quite the same thing. I mean, I always have to remember you're on the West Coast, so who knows what you're dealing with over there. What about parthenogenesis? Like, what about exterminating the male of the species? Like, there were feminists
there's a movie with that premise.
There's a novel, isn't there? Is it Monique Wittig? Or who is it? There might be more than one novel.
I've seen the crappy Netflix movie World Without Men, which was actually
I did not see that.
Yeah. But putting aside feminism.
No, I mean, in other words, maybe for women to become free, the male of the species has to be wiped out. Okay. Like, in other words, look, wipe me out, fine. Like, I have no, like, there's no sentimental attachment to penises walking around.
Right? Chris, you're not the problem. It's guys like me that are the problem. The straight guys.
Why? Because
that's what they really want to get rid of. That's what
I guess so. But they also, like phallocentrism, whatever, like everything. I mean, the gays are phallocentric, aren't they?
True, but you can maybe.
And aren't they reducing? Isn't there an Andrea Dworkin criticism of gay men that they just reenact like heterosexuality among themselves?
Well, it's just an afterthought, is all I'm saying. It's an afterthought. The point here is...
But what I'm saying is Marxism, like, for me, obviously, I have a kind of a worldview. I think about things as capitalism. I'm very wedded to the history of socialism and Marxism. The case for me about, like, why people should not be radical feminists or Islamic fundamentalists is that the greatest social and political movement of all time in world history of the subaltern was led by Marxism.
Right.
And so the track record of the others is weak.
I want to go back to Postone. I've been trying to get back to Postone.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I don't disagree with anything we've been saying. You've been saying so far at all. Which means obviously I should be canceled. But Postone, the post-proletariat politics of Postone.
Yes.
To equate that with a move towards the movement politics of the new left.
He thought the new social movements showed the possibility of a post-proletarian politics, even if not in kind of ready-made form. And he did think that after the 60s, what happened was that the social movements became premature post-capitalism.
Okay,
and avoided the problem of capitalism in a bad way.
Right, exactly. So this is important because obviously, if the proletariat abolishes itself, if we do overcome the commodity form or the society based on labor, and we overcome capital and capitalism,
Hmm.
then we will have a post-proletariat politics, and in a sense, the revolutionary task of the
Is to
proletariat.
produce that.
Right. So it's not really to condemn Pistone to say that he has that aim, and it doesn't mean he's
No.
necessarily wanting to walk away from Marxism and say, okay, I'm going to embrace
Well, he wanted
Margaret
to walk
Atwood.
away from Lenin, and that's who I'm channeling today.
Okay,
I'm actually channeling Lenin all days. You
okay,
may or
okay.
may not know that.
Mhm.
And and I kind of feel like, what did Lenin notoriously say about like feminism? He said, "Isn't it just a retread of bourgeois libertinism?
Mhm.
And wasn't it better back then than it is now?"
Mhm.
Right? Like the kind of, I guess, cultural feminism of his time. And
Mhm.
Marxists were not feminists; they were anti-feminists. Like Rosa Luxemburg was an anti-feminist. Clara
Mhm.
Zetkin was an anti-feminist. When they said it was bourgeois feminism, they didn't mean that it was just rich women.
Mhm.
They meant it was a vain attempt to liberate women within capitalism without overcoming capitalism. And that's
Right.
why they were against feminism. Now, they were, of course, for women's equality, for sexual freedom, for liberalized marriage and divorce, for, not abortion rights, but decriminalization of abortion. Because abortion rights means you can make the state pay for your abortion.
Mhm.
And that's tricky, right? In other words, under capitalism, that's tricky because that means it's going to be a political football,
Right.
right? It means I don't want my tax money to pay for something I morally disapprove of. It's some shit, right? It just
Mhm.
becomes this shit. And
Mhm.
by the way, the Democrats like it that way.
Mhm.
They like that. It
Well,
has that
sure,
effect.
because it gives them something to run on and to talk about, and to
It gives them an opponent.
gives them an opponent, gives them a way to do capitalist politics.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yep. And keep
and,
women enthralled to them, even
right,
though most women are anti abortion.
yeah, well, right there, it keeps their women enthralled to them. But the I no, I see all that, but I'm really concerned more about overcoming capitalism and what that
Well,
vision
that's the
is.
thing, right? Like that. So that's the thing. And I kind of feel like, how are we going to do that? And, I'm just very conservative about this, which is to say, we need a fucking political party that's going to overthrow the state
Right. So
and
this is
take
so
power.
I want to see the connection between, like, one
Debord
of
does not like that. And neither
right.
did Pistone.
But the board was clearly not saying, okay, we need to, did not intend anyway, maybe dialectically, maybe if we think dialectically about Stone and about the board and about the value theorists in Germany, that they
Mm-hmm.
end up actually avoiding their responsibility to
Mm-hmm.
overcome capitalism, by, even as they insist that they want to be absolutely clear and hard line about the necessity for overcoming what they see as the fundamental of capitalism, which for Debord was the spectacle, and
Mm-hmm.
for the value theorists is the commodity form. I'm closer to them.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but and for others it might be the capitalist state, but there's all these different attempts to,
Well, it's one
uh,
step at a time.
right.
You don't overthrow the commodity form or abolish or let it wither away or whatever.
You can't
Overcome
let
it.
it wither away. You have to overcome it through a
You do have
political
to
act.
do something, but even then it's going to be there. And so the question is, what will happen to it? I mean, I would say, so I'll also channel Adorno, I suppose, in
Mhm.
Adorno's Leninism. That again, in the 20th century, you had a kind of regression of Marxism. You had a kind of recrudescence of romantic socialism and the idea that the problem of capitalism is like the division of labor, specialization, representation, political representation.
Mhm.
And what he condemned as the resuscitation of anarchism as a ghost of itself, and that's
Mhm.
in the 60s. He's saying that, and he
Mhm.
called it the impatience with theory, by which he meant the impatience with Marxism.
Hmm.
you know. And I think the problem with, whether Debord or Postone or the value critics is that they assume that the working class is organized as a collective bargaining unit economically, that it's politically organized as a political party or parties. It's got socialist parties and communist parties.
Hmm.
And it assumes a kind of social preponderance of the working class, like in the culture and in society at large. And I think that all of those things have been undone, or something has changed since the 60s. And so we can't assume that they were ready to kind of transcend the old horizon of working class socialism.
Hmm.
And it's like, well, no, what you did was you liquidated it. But you also mistook what I would consider to be already a liquidation of it for its constitution, meaning the Stalinist Communist Party of France was not a revolutionary proletarian socialist party. It was not.
Hmm.
And I mean, clearly it wasn't. And so therefore you can't presume it and say we need to go beyond it.
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, on that point, you are in agreement with Debord about his, in some ways, about his critique of Stalinism, although he would
You call it Leninism.
yeah, he would call it Bolshevism.
Yeah,
Or
and he would say that that is the heart of the Russian Revolution to establish this, and I would say no, there's the betrayal of the revolution. I mean, I am Trotskyist in that sense, but
Right.
I'm also a follower of the Frankfurt School, meaning they also did not think that Bolshevism led to Stalinism or Lenin led to Stalin. They don't.
Right.
And so, that is the big mistake of the left comms. And that's where Debord comes from. He comes from the socialism or barbarism,
Right.
Castoriadis.
So, like, right. I know. And what happened to
And
Castoriadis?
Castoriadis is a Lacanian too. Social imaginary,
Right.
which is a term that Postone uses too. It seeps in there. This Heideggerian stuff seeps in there. The metaphysics in our mind is the problem. No.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So, well, with Castro, but I don't think Raya Dostoevskaya was Heideggerian.
She is
I don't
not.
know. And she was also a part of that milieu. Castriatis joined up with Raya Dostoevskaya and wrote Facing Reality, and they had a little sect called that, and he was aligned with the Johnson Forest
Yeah,
tendency,
there
and
were lost souls in the 50s. I mean, they all become more or less lost souls, including C.L.R. James. And I
Mhm.
feel for them. I understand. I mean, I get it.
Mhm.
The Revolutionary Project was defeated, and it
Right.
liquidated itself in the preceding generation in the 20s and 30s.
Right.
And at least we have C.L.R. James's history of the Third International to
Mhm.
help explain how and why that happened, right? But Dunievskaya, it's a little bit trickier because then she retreats to Hegel.
Right. Well, she tries to bring Hegel back into Marxism, which is something else that is
I'm
tricky to understand.
sympathetic.
Yeah,
I'm sympathetic, but
yeah,
the trick there is that it's got to go both ways. Meaning,
right.
you have to see the Marxist critique of Hegel as not just a rejection of Hegel or an opposition to Hegel, and also not a transcendence of Hegel. It's a radicalization of Hegel, is what it is. But it also suggests, look, I've been ragging on the Lacanians and the Heideggerians. There's a real crisis of Hegelianism, meaning
Right.
there is like a kernel of truth to the anti-Hegelian philosophy. And that kernel of truth has to be reckoned with. That's like a real historical phenomenon. It's not a thought error,
Mm-hmm.
right? In the same way that I would say Lacan betrayed Freud, but as an authentic historical symptom, not just as like a mistake,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, in that way, Dunievskaya, because she has her own way of like restoring Hegel to Marx and Marxism, but without, or with, her criticism of Lukács and Korsch and of the Frankfurt School.
Mm-hmm.
Although, dalliances with Marcuse and Fromm,
Mm-hmm.
Fromm more problematically.
Mm-hmm.
And there is this idea that I've heard from the Marxist humanists, for instance, Kevin Anderson, in an interview that we did in Platypus with him, where he said Hegel's more of a humanist than Marx is. And he thinks that that means that Hegel's better than Marx. And I feel like, no, that's the problem. But that doesn't mean you become an Althusserian, where the anti-humanism is Heideggerian and Lacanian.
Right.
Right?
Yeah,
So
I
again,
mean, the problem. I think I agree with most.
it's not
of
about
what you
taking
just said.
sides. It's not about taking sides.
That's the thing that when we start to use these names as shorthand for concepts, it easily becomes a matter of,
Camps.
do you like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones? You know,
shit.
you know, yeah. And so,
Right.
like I feel as though it's important to remember that Lacan and Heidegger, while they may have Heidegger may have influenced Lacan did attempt to reject Heidegger, and his there was a return, at least from Zizek's. Zizek would argue that there was a return to Hegel in Lacan, and Zizek doesn't call himself a Heideggerian anymore. He's a Hegelian and a Marxist even, although not a very good one in my opinion, but a good thinker and fun guy.
Sure.
So the what I would
My
say is
point
that,
would be that dialectic has been lost. And not accidentally, not as a thought error, but because the dialectic that Marxism developed was liquidated at a political level.
well, it couldn't exist except at a political level,
Right.
because of the commodity fetish. Basically, it doesn't exist in the political economy on its own, it doesn't exist in bourgeois society. It has to exist as a revolutionary
And it
force.
exists in the recognition of alienation. It does. Meaning what we were talking about earlier. In other words, a view of history that doesn't throw out Hegel or junk Hegel, but recognizes that Hegelian history has been falsified in capitalism as like a real process. And so what we were talking about, in other words, so I'll invoke Juliet Mitchell again, who said, the problem is that capitalism changes. And it changes through a dialectical process. It becomes its opposite. And so liberation can always look like it's the opposite of what it was a generation ago. Right? And we should also say that with the liquidation of a proletarian socialist left, a Marxist socialist left, that a lot of desire for freedom, impulse for freedom, is expressed on the right. And that's why I brought up Islamic fundamentalism. Right? And there are various kinds of right wing, obviously, very different from each other and opposed to each other. But where the impulse to freedom is not taken up in a strongly political way in a proletarian socialist movement, in capitalism it's going to come out in ideological ways. Otherwise, it's going to come out on the right. And you could say, I mean, what you were talking about, like radical feminism is like radical womanism. That's like right wing, obviously. But maybe also other kinds of radical feminism are right wing as well. Certainly I'm suddenly thinking of Adolf Reed, and black nationalism is right wing. And he even calls it fascism. It's black fascism. And he sees it as just a kind of vanguard of capitalism. Right? Like a kind of pseudo-radical ideology of racial capitalism. Right? And that's going to sound all very, obscure to people. But again, being able to recognize that, which we barely can do today. In other words, that's why we have to talk about it in this kind of elliptical way. Whereas it was much clearer to Lenin that the dictatorship of the proletariat was not the realm of freedom. And yet it was necessary.
Right.
It was not an advance in freedom. It was part of a political process that could yield freedom, but was not itself freedom.
Right. So this is where I think where a lot of times people on the left, especially when you're starting out, you want to do this debate about questions that maybe you're not prepared to answer. And what I
Anarchism
mean
and
is,
Marxism.
right, like, oh, am I going to be an anarchist or am I going to be a Marxist? I want to know that at the outset. Do I believe in workers' councils or do I believe in the dictatorship of the proletariat? Am I,
As
like,
if those are opposites.
right, as if those are opposites, right? But right, so let's say they're not. In which case, then we might even have even less qualm with Debord than we seem to be having, because one of the things he keeps reiterating over and over and over again is that the only way to uh, beat the spectacle, to overcome this passivity, to live, just to have a life, is to put all power to the workers' councils.
I have news for you. The goal is not to live or life. We're done. Meaning we've lived and we didn't live. Life does not live. Wrong life cannot be lived rightly. Adorno.
Right.
Right. And so what are we doing? In other words, we are products of the past whose task is to ensure that in the future, what we do doesn't make the future also a slave to the past.
Chris, it just seems so unfair.
But we are slaves to the past.
I know. No, but just because, for me, the way my mind works, I am stuck. But the idea that I'm only now giving up on the idea of being the young generation.
Holy
at
shit.
50. Really, okay.
What is this middle age crisis?
It's been like 10 years, really. But no, the point is, like, I realized it 10 years ago, really firmly. But nonetheless, it's living memory of having that crisis. And to say, oh yeah, not that I was born too soon.
We're just not struggling for our own liberation, and neither was Lenin. He understood that.
Right.
He understood it was not for his personal liberation or for the liberation of his generation. They understood that.
Right.
They really did. That's why Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg could say revolutionaries are dead men on leave.
But Debord definitely thought that he was struggling for his own liberation and the liberation of his generation.
That's why it's infantile.
Right. Yeah.
And again, maybe in a way
that was a common 60s.
It was, but that fucking generation, look at what they did to us.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah.
They were so narcissistic, and they left the world. They didn't care the world that they left to us.
Because they were wanting that revolution right then,
right now,
without a plan.
I mean, when I was, that I'm, I don't know if I've mentioned this to you in another interview, but so I do this campaign for a socialist party, which is like a kind of guerrilla movement, like underground, like something, right? Not deliberately underground, like we're above ground, but one of the first people we recruited to it recognized right away a black gay guy whose extended family had participated in the civil rights movement. He said, it's a generational sacrifice that we're going to have to make. And that's the way the civil rights movement understood what they were doing, that they weren't going to live in the freedom that they were fighting for. Come on. Like, that's just political maturity to recognize that.
Right. I understand. I agree. But nonetheless, maybe what we can say is it's in order for people in the future, for humanity,
to not be dealing with the same shit we're dealing with,
to actually live and have some freedom and responsibility, the workers' councils will have to take power and transform society. And that's what Debord was saying, even though he was saying it should happen right then, and even though he was saying, why are my friends and I so sad? Why am I an alcoholic?
It makes some sense. I'm not unsympathetic entirely to that generation, but we do have to. There is an Oedipal struggle with that generation. There is. There's no getting around it, because they were really smart, they were really talented, they were really privileged. They had a lot of time and energy. They wrote these brilliant little books. in a way that we don't. We can't because of our misery.
We could do it. We're going to be able to.
It's going to be a little bit less motivated. So I would say that, again, he thought that, it's a little bit, it shares the moment with Maoism, which is that you can liberate the working class from the party, but that you do it on the basis of the working class being organized by the party, but then you make them rebel against the party. And then that's like the revolution. It's like the Kronstadt revolt.
Mm-hmm.
No. Kronstadt revolt. They were left SR anti-Semites. There were some bullshit anarchists. They were not like the Bolshevik rank and file rebelling against the party. No, that was not what happened. But this is what people imagine. And the reason that they imagine it is that that's their historical experience of these massive parties, right, that look like the obstacle to socialism. And that were the obstacle to socialism. But we don't have that now. So one little anecdote I presented at a Adorno conference, and in Amsterdam, of all places. And this kind of left-com guy, who is a kind of like influenced by value critique and by Postone. He was on a panel with me, and I won't name him just because. And and he said it was him, a baby boomer, me, and a millennial. And the millennial guy, I think Austrian, had said something like, took a deep dive into the Frankfurt School and was sad to discover that their theory of late capitalism was just a Leninist view of imperialism. Right? It was like an anticlimax for him to realize, oh no, they were just Leninists. That there was nothing new theoretically here. And then the other guy said that the purpose of critical theory today is to prevent Chris Cutrone from reestablishing the Leninist Party.
He actually said that directly?
Yes. And I said, yeah, I'm gonna keep that, because it really is what we're up against, Doug.
That's crazy.
It's what we're up against. It's the reality.
That's very, I guess I would imagine he had his tongue in his cheek when he said it.
No, he was like hair on fire, kind of like upset by me.
Oh.
Yeah, he's like upset that I exist. Right?
Oh,
and he's like,
right.
You're a student of Moishe Postone, how dare you be a Leninist? And he recognized that I made a compelling case. Right? And so he's like, this is the threat. The threat is that we're going to repeat Leninism. And I'm like, we could only be so lucky.
Right. I don't know if I've told you this anecdote before, but I once worked at a physician's answering service, and at that time, I was in my 20s, and my first kid was on his way, and I remember going to like a zine shop and picking up some weird pamphlet about workers' rebellion, workers' revolution, and I brought it to work, and I was reading it on my break, and the boss, the guy who very rarely came in, the person who really ran the place, walked through, and he saw me reading this, and he got livid. He said, if that ever happened, this place would completely collapse. You guys don't know what you're doing. And he just really like pointing at me. And I thought,
that's true. In other words, there's a truth to that. I mean, I would say that
sure, but I was shocked that he deigned to care. It was like he was like, oh, me reading this actually threatens him. I thought it was just some pose I was doing. I had no idea that.
No, so what I would say is that it's better for young people today to read Lenin's State and Revolution than to read Debord's Society of the Spectacle.
It would probably have been better for me, too.
Yes.
Right? Yeah.
As long as you didn't then later read Debord and think that Debord transcended Lenin or something. Right, which is obviously what people thought in the 60s and in the 70s and 80s. And I feel like, and of course, to read Lenin, you have to read it all the way through, and you have to understand that the first determination is not the last determination, meaning, that the state is a, class structure to keep one class down by another class, because then later he gets into bourgeois right under the dictatorship of the proletariat and Critique of the Gotha program, and he really gets all the way into the depths of the problem. and and again, a dialectical view of the state and revolution and proletarian socialist revolution. And that, again, the difference is going to be that it's going to be drier. It's going to be more sober. It's going to be like this book report. It's not going to be the kind of aphoristic essayism of Debord. It's not going to be as enchanting.
Right.
And so it's not going to be aesthetically satisfying, and it's not going to satisfy the bohemian rebel and romantic in the reader,
which is good. That's actually good, because what did that become in the 90s? It became a freaking lifestyle. It had already become that 30 years earlier. It was obviously a dead end to think that by being a certain kind of urban bohemian type, you could have your revolution without changing anything. That was dead already. That was dead on arrival. What Debord represented for me was not the parts of the way in which he helped to facilitate the end of Leninism and the end of the Marxist project, but the fact that he was still of it. To read Debord then was to turn away from
anarchism,
the Clintons and the anarchism of both, right? It was to turn away from the politics, the really existing politics of the moment, and to say, oh, there was something called revolution.
What do you think of his further thoughts on the Society of Spectacle from the 80s?
Common Sense. I think it's been a while since I've read it. I recall it being a turn into paranoia and conspiracism.
Was it?
Yeah, but maybe that's wrong. I'm not saying it was. That's what I recall of it. But I read it last around 2001.
Okay, so a while ago.
Yeah, in a moment where
I'm not endorsing it per se, but I remember finding it interesting.
Yeah, well, it's worth. I'm going to take a break from Debord after I finish this series of videos, and I'm going to take up refuting Albert's unorthodox Marxism.
From back in the day.
From back in the 80s, where he says he basically refuted Marxism, and I'm just gonna, because to me, okay, being anti-Lenin,
him and everybody else,
right? Being anti-Lenin, whatever, that's bad, I guess. Being anti-Marx, that I cannot accept.
I mean, the thing is what Lenin stands for. I mean, in other words, Lenin, I think is like a titanic figure. I don't think we'd be talking about Marx at all without Lenin.
Right.
For better or for worse.
We might be if the German Revolution had come off, we might still be talking about Marx. Right.
Sure, yeah, but that would have only happened because of Lenin.
Right.
So, I mean, yes, that generation should have been eclipsed, right? Like, in other words, Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky should have been surpassed a long time ago. The fact that we have to think about them now is a tragedy. They would be chagrined.
We have to think about a Hegel now. We have to even, we have to think about a lot of stuff now that we ought maybe not to. But
Kant and Hegel, because they belong to the bourgeois firmament, maybe they're not as disturbed. They'd be disturbed too by the fact that we're still cracking our heads against them. They'd be disturbed, but they wouldn't be as disturbed because I feel like Marxism is a much more secular, political, more immediate kind of ambition, whereas Kant and Hegel could say, oh, freedom takes a few hundred more years. Yeah, what's that in the grand scheme of things? Right? Whereas Marxism is clock is ticking. We're overripe for revolution. Every second after 1848 is a liability. Because it's unnecessary.
Well, listen, I have speaking of not being able to live my life correctly, I have a therapy appointment in about 10 minutes, so I should go. But this was great. This was a really good. You didn't really let me have the conversation I wanted. We had the conversation this is how it is. So we had the conversation we needed to have because there's two of us here. It's not just me pontificating. So this was really good. And we'll have to come back not to Debord, but to some of these questions that we keep circling around. And thanks, Chris. And the sound got better as we went along. So that's something I need to learn too.